there.
I've done this for 60 years. Okay. I can't sit down to read a poem because I sat down in Moose Jaw once on a stool and I fainted in the middle of the poem, and I said, I think I'm going to black out, and I fell off, and everybody thought that was part of the poem. So I'm superstitious. This is a poem hot off the press. I don't usually do this. It's the 22nd draft, and I started it in the Terminal 2 at Vancouver Airport yesterday. I'm a terrible flyer. Every time I fly, I think I'm going to die, and I don't. So the poem is called Momentary Resurrection. I am dressing to die, is what I tell myself, as I choose the clothes I'd feel comfortable enough to be cremated in. My tatty cashmere sweater, lucky jeans, red boots of Spanish leather, the morning I'm scheduled to fly out of Masset on Pacific Coastal. It might be the last time I pull on the pair of gray lamb's wool socks I bought last November in Ireland. Of course I had to risk flying to Dublin to purchase them, and I survived. But today, shortly after takeoff, which is always when things happen, right? I imagine my feet still cozied up inside these breathable Irish ultra soft socks separated from the rest of my body. I see my head severed too, and it brings to mind the 6 million skulls in the catacombs of Paris, all once filled with a mortal longing, the kind I am having now, as I gaze out over the mountains and see my life come asunder, my international jet-setting body scattered along the Pacific Coastal Range. But then, we land in Vancouver. Even though I thought I would welcome death, I'm relieved to be alive, as if there could be anything more I might care about, something so impossible it makes me want to live.
Yes.
I'm sure we're all feeling that about right now. We need something that makes us, it's impossible enough to make us want to live. I also have a third claim to fame. My husband wrote a piece for Playboy magazine where he called me the most interesting, beautiful woman on the planet, but he was in prison at the time at William Head, so my story is that he didn't meet any other women where he was living, so he was elevated. Anyway, thank you for coming, and thanks for inviting me back after 14
Woohoo!
years. Michael, you mentioned titles, and I thought I wrote a piece. I'm going to get to you. Sorry. The Leon Uris wrote a book called Mila 18, and apparently Joseph Heller was going to call Catch 22 Catch 18, and his publishers said you can't do that because there's already a book coming out. Very interesting fact about titles. So actually, I'm going to start with the third question I had for you, which is the easiest one, I think. My life is full of questions. I have 2 granddaughters who are twins, and one, when she was 5, used to hate going to bed, so she'd have all these questions for me at bedtime. And my favorite was, do beavers live complicated lives? So, I'm going to ask you. As a writer, what would you choose as your mascot or spirit animal, and why? And if you don't have one, you can just make one up. Nobody will know, right?
Okay, so she had promised by email that she wouldn't ask me the beaver question.
That's a great question.
Okay, my mascot animal. I just fostered a cat for 8 months and finally adopted her. And her name is Harriet, so I feel like that would be my choice. She is riddled with illness. Like we actually have that in common. So yeah, Harriet the cat. Yeah, they gave her to me for free because of her health issues.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, great. Well, I hope you're not really riddled with illness. I mean, there's a trauma specialist here if we need one. But, yeah. Want to ask me a question?
Okay. I have some written down here, but after hearing you read, I wanted to ask about your approach to writing humor. Like, why are you drawn to using humor in your work? And maybe if you could talk a bit about your experience of reading funny poems aloud to an audience.
Well, it's disconcerting sometimes when people get one of my books and they say, and then they hear me read and they say, I didn't know you were funny. And I think that doesn't maybe come across so much on the page. But then my last book wasn't, well, there were some funny poems, but it's hard when you're writing about people overdosing and dying to be funny. But I think that the one thing I have going for me when it comes to writing about grief is that, because there are a lot of books right now about grief. Everybody's losing people they love at our age. When I'm in the death zone, you're not, but everybody I know is losing people. So I think that comedy and tragedy are born joined at the hip, and if I couldn't laugh at myself particularly, I don't think I'd still be here today. It's the only thing that's kept me going, and I lose my sense of humor a lot. It's not very easy to have it in this world. But socks are a great thing to write about because you can be kind of flippant about socks. I have a whole long poem about my husband's socks, which I'll read tomorrow, because when he died, he left me a drawer full of statement socks. And they're starting to wear out, and now I feel guilty. But so I think that in creative nonfiction, I can be funny, or I allow myself to be funny. But poetry, sometimes it just happens. I mean, I don't sit down thinking I'm going to write a funny poem. I thought I was going to. I really do dislike flying, and I think every morning when I'm flying, or actually even every morning when I get out of bed, this could be the last time I put these clothes on. It's just sort of a morbid way of living, but that's how I am. And I'd hate to live with me. Not fun to sit next to on an airplane.
Well, I find there's such an electricity to reading something funny aloud to an audience and hearing that reaction. Personally, before I started reading to audiences, I always wrote serious. And then I remember I was writing something for an audience that didn't read literary fiction. It was the students I was teaching at Johns Hopkins at the time. They were pre-med, and I was like, I'm just going to write something funny and something with pop culture references, something accessible. And just hearing that reaction was so thrilling. I was curious if you felt that way, or.
It's so much easier to judge laughter for many years I never read any of my serious poems because I didn't want to leave everybody feeling like taking their lives after reading. So I thought it's way easier to make people laugh. And I think I did my poetry a disservice. And maybe the audience too. I think audiences can take more than I just didn't want to depress people and make them feel awful. But so I try to do a balance now of things, or at least in between poems, make something up lighter that's easier, because you can't just inundate people with sorrow and grief. You need to there needs to be a balance.
Yeah, it sounds like your approach is less self-involved than mine.
Oh, I'm sure you're not self-involved. You're being humble. You're a humble person, I can tell. So another question. Okay, you wrote a tweet. You've had to answer this a few times, right? What doesn't kill you makes you write short stories. That's online. And so the question is a fairly general one. To what extent do your real life experiences shape your storytelling?
Oh, yes. I'm a fiction writer, so essentially I'm a coward. And I always think people who write memoirs or who write autobiographical poetry, that takes guts. And I always have the veil of fiction. I do write from personal experience, but it always kind of shifts and morphs, and I want to write the better story, not the story that's most true to what happened. It is interesting that people always seem to assume my work is autobiographical, even when it isn't. I guess especially my last book was in first person, and the character had the same gender and race as me, so people make that assumption. But even this book, which has different perspective, different ages, and I went for drinks with some friends afterwards, and there's a lot of dating and relationships in my book. And my friend who had met some people I'd been in relationships she was like, was this Phil? And this one. And then trying to identify the people and the fictional characters in my book with the people in my life, which I found quite alarming, and maybe that's why I feel kind of lucky to write fiction, so at least I have plausible deniability.
We have poetic license and then persona poetry, so you could always say, oh, that's not me, it's a persona. But it's pretty hard when you're writing very personal stuff there's always an element of the truth. There's a germ of truth. Well, I have another question that's kind of related to character. Joyce Carey, when asked if he based his characters on people he knew, said, never, you can't. Real people are too complex and disorganized for books. They aren't simple enough, which I thought was really interesting. So have you ever based any of your characters on in quotes, real people, including yourself? And what, if anything, do we owe the real people upon whom we might attempt to base our characters? That's a difficult question. You can avoid it and just answer the first one. I thought there is something. What do we do if people see themselves? Usually they see themselves in something they haven't. There's no way that could possibly be in the book, but people will see themselves if they want to.
Yeah, and the short story that I read from is, I think, partly my answer to that question. Like and that's the one people always ask me if it's autofiction, and I think of it as metafiction about the ethics of autofiction and what it feels like to be written about. I have been written about, and I have written about people I know. I usually do the Frankenstein collaging thing. I'm also very lucky that I have a forgiving family. Yeah, and like my parents, maybe it's because they don't really read fiction. But I've written characters inspired by my parents, and even again when they're fictionalized, people assume that's who they are. Maybe I'll ask you along the same lines, like, so much of your work is deeply personal. Has it always been that way, and how did you become comfortable with that?
Well, I've never become comfortable with anything. I don't know if my work's more personal now or if it was. It's just different. You change over. You hope you change over 60, 50 years. When did I start writing? When I was 14. My parents do feature. I remember my mother saying, "I guess I gave you the wrong father," which was sad because. And I said, "Mom, it wasn't Dad in the poem; it was a father figure." But they still see it as, because there is again that germ of truth in the. And I think I take physical pain and change it into emotional imagery, so or vice versa. So there's a lot of I even forget where poems come from, like what in my life, because they become their own world and their own poem, and I don't have much to do with it other than put my name to it. Even then, I don't do that sometimes. But so what was your question again? Personal. Oh,
I guess how you become comfortable.
Oh yeah, how I there's still poems I wouldn't read, or I just hope my mother's dead now, so she's not reading my books. Well, I have one book called, which is short essays called "You're in Canada Now, Motherfucker," which was a line an RCMP officer said to a smuggler when he's hitting him over the head with his gun. And I put a Canadian flag over the word "fucker," so it just said "You're in Canada Now, Mother," to give my mom. I Bowdlerized the book to the title so that she should read it and not be offended. So I never heard my mother ever swear. I never heard it. So proper family, and the worst thing you can do is have a writer for a child. I think every parent's nightmare.
Actually, the first question I had written down here, I think, relates to what you were just saying. But you've had a long career and have written and published books in multiple genres, and I'm curious how your relationship to your writing or your approach to writing has changed over that time, if it has.
Oh yeah, of course it has. I think I'm lazier than I used to be. I mean, I have about 35 books, and people, as soon as you publish a book, you know this from book tours, well, what's your next book about? I feel like saying, well, this took me 15 years to write this one. And I don't really think, I think people are just being polite when they ask those questions. They really don't want you to go into how the blood pours from your forehead is with the sweat. And they just want you to say, and so I think Stephen King had an answer. People would say, ask him questions like, writing any good books lately? They asked him amazing questions. That's a really hard, writing any good books lately. So he learned to say, I'm taking some time off. That was the best answer, because if you try to tell the truth, you just get wrapped up. If somebody asks you what you're writing, I always just say, well, now I just say I'm taking some time off, like the rest of my life. But then I wrote a poem yesterday, so I can't really say that.
Woohoo!
It's just the other things, the non-fiction and fiction. It's such hard work. Poetry is, Ezra Pound says that poetry is the positive celebration of an image or thought long pondered, whereas prose is the process of the purgation and therefore negative in content. Why I remember that, I don't know. It's very cerebral. But I think that poetry, I can get it all in one sitting, and then I can revise for weeks. Like the last poem, not this one, this is only draft 22, but there were 91 drafts of it. And, So fiction, and it just takes so much time, and you have to do it every day, otherwise you lose touch with it, right? Is that what happens if you lose it for a week? Then it takes you 2 weeks to get back into it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm afraid if I do that, I'll just stop writing forever. I think we've been given our 1 minute.
Oh, we probably give it way over time. Yeah. Doing great.
Woohoo!
Thank you so much, Shashi and Susan. It is time for an intermission.